I am again reading today from Swami Kriyananda's book, A Renunciate Order for the New Age. And in it, he says that ego transcendence is the essence of the spiritual path. And he devotes an entire chapter to very practical ways in which we can work with our ego. And I'll read a short passage from this book. Be more aware of what you give out to others than of what you receive from them. Even in gratitude, your focus should be more on your expression of it than on the appreciation you feel. So, it's important to express appreciation. Everybody wants it. Everybody needs it. It helps people. You can see this especially in children. If you praise what they've done, it helps to give them confidence and not to reinforce their ego. There's lots of ways to work with that in children, helping them to share, expanding their sense of identity. All these things are very important, but for adults, there is so little appreciation in this world. It's very important that we are grateful for whatever people do and express that appreciation. For ourselves, it's important to not expect it, not expect appreciation, and not to look for it, not to look for pats on the back for anything that we do, but instead give it to God. There was a beautiful moment when Swami Kriyananda in India, had just finished a whole year's worth of daily videos. I think it was talking about conversations with Yogananda, or it may have been the Bhagavad Gita. He did both. And at that moment, Dharmadas and I were living in the same house with Swami. Our room was right across the hallway from his. And he had just finished this enormous body of work. And his health was not that good. He had fallen recently, and he had big red wounds on his head, not deep, but he asked me to cover them up with some makeup because he didn't want to look like he'd been beat up on television. So it was quite an intense thing that he did, and he was pretty exhausted. And afterwards, the people who were gathered in the room watching the filming gave him a standing ovation and gave him a garland of flowers around his neck. And he very graciously pranamed, and then he quietly left the room. And I was sort of his assistant at that point, and I wanted to make sure he didn't need anything, like maybe a cup of tea, or I could help in some way. So I hovered in the hallway between his room and our room just to see if he would call me for anything. And it was so sweet because I saw him as he entered his room. He took off the garland that had been placed around his neck, and he went over to his altar and he put the garland there, offering it to Master. Even tremendous effort and wonderful things to be done in this world, like create an entire year's worth of television programs talking about Yogananda. even that, he wouldn't accept anything for himself. He just gave it to God. I remember too, another time we were with Swami in Italy, in his house there, and we were standing in his kitchen, and it was pretty much the last few hours of that trip, and we had been with him for a week or two maybe. But often a very significant conversation would happen at some point during one of those trips to be together. And this one happened in the last few hours. We were standing in the kitchen of Swami's house, and he very strongly was saying to me, Nirmala, you have to take into account other people's nature when you're dealing with them. You can't just be, sort of blanket way of dealing with people. You have to tune into each person's nature. And so we talked about this for a bit, and then I said, well, what about my nature? And he stopped for a moment and he said, you can't afford to have a nature, which is very good advice. We can't afford to ask for people to understand us. We have to go within. We have to let God understand us. And as Swami is saying in one of the previous readings too, don't admit your faults openly and freely to everyone, because very often they can use that information against you. In other words, go inside. Find that equilibrium, find those answers within yourself. And of course, if you need advice, if you're at a sticking point, the meditation technique is to go very deep into meditation, and then when you've finished your practices, strongly visualize the light at the point between the eyebrows, and then offer that problem up to God, asking for a solution. And very often that solution will come in that moment. And of course, talk with your friends. If you want to get something off your chest or want to hear what they have to say, what they would do in that situation. But it's very important to choose wisely what you say about yourself to others. For example, a friend of mine some years ago had gone through a terrible divorce. One of her friends became involved with her husband. They went through an awful time. And some years later, this new couple wanted to move near where my friend lived. And my friend was complaining about it because she had heard that they said they were worried that people wouldn't accept them because of what had happened with my friend. And she was going off on how awful they had been and why were they saying these things and so on and so on. And she wanted me to side with her. She wanted me to get into it with her and say, yes, they're terrible. But instead, I tried to hold up the highest that was in her too. Certainly, she's a very high soul. And I instead responded, oh, those poor people, they're really suffering. That's so sad. And I kept expressing empathy and sympathy for them. And after a while, she changed. And she saw it too. And we helped each other through that experience. So choose friends who will not just get into gossip with you and agree with how awful other people are or whatever, but choose someone who will hold up the highest and try to really help you transcend the ego. Because that's where our happiness lies.